Okay, good afternoon. My name is Sonja Schmid. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Science, Technology and Society at Virginia Tech, and I co-direct the graduate program in Science and Technology Studies in Northern Virginia. Welcome to SIREN. This is the 25th event in a series of seminars, talks and discussion on nuclear emergency response. The series is part of my NSF Career Award on globalizing nuclear emergency response, and in the spirit of this type of grant, we emphasize the importance of both research and education in the area of nuclear emergency preparedness and response. So all our SIREN speakers are meeting with graduate students as part of their engagement, and we plan to provide access to recordings of their lectures. SIREN, the Seminar on Interdisciplinary Research and Education in Nuclear Emergency Response, is generously supported by Virginia Tech's Office of the Vice President for the National Capital Region and the Policy Strategic Growth Area. Today's talk is also supported by an international initiatives grant from the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. Many thanks to the staff of the Virginia Tech Research Center's Executive Briefing Center and the IT team for their support, and to the students, staff, and faculty in the Department of STS for helping to make this happen. Today's talk will be live streamed, and we have about 40 remote participants signed up as of this morning. These attendees are joining us not only from our main campus in Blacksburg, other U.S. universities, federal agencies, and national labs, but also from the International Atomic Energy Agency and from abroad, including France and Germany. Welcome. If you are watching us online and would like to submit a question to the speaker, please send an email indicating your name and affiliation to siren@virginiatech.edu. Also, if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, we use it only to announce SIREN events, you can now join our Google group SIREN series. I also wanted to announce that thanks to the efforts of Tom Goff, a health physicist and radiological engineer with the Texas-based company Waste Control Specialists, the American Academy of Health Physics has granted one continuing education unit per SIREN webinar. I'd be happy to share the ID number upon request. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Klaus Gehrcke is head of the Division of Radiation Protection and Environment in the Federal Office for Radiation Protection, the Bundesamt für Strahlenschutz in Germany. He experienced the Chernobyl accident as a young health physicist in former Eastern Germany and was thereafter involved in the planning and building up of an emergency response system in Eastern Germany. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the ensuing German reunification, Dr. Gehrcke became involved in the expansion of the newly established Integrated Measurement and Information System for the Surveillance and Environmental Radioactivity to the new federal states. His responsibilities in the Federal Office for Radiation Protection today comprise exposures of the population from any source of ionizing radiation, including nuclear emergency preparedness and response. Dr. Gehrcke is member of the German Radiation Protection Association, and he serves on the group of the experts according to Article 31 of the Euratom Treaty, the European Atomic Energy Community, which provides guidance to the European Commission on all aspects concerning the harmonization of radiation protection standards in the European Union. This group has recently updated and expanded Euratom's basic safety standards for protection against the dangers arising from exposure to ionizing radiation. A council directive from 2013 also set out detailed requirements for emergency response plans and called for closer cooperation among member states to secure uniform emergency response measures. One more thing, I'm particularly indebted to Gerald Kirchner, professor at the Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker Center for Science and Peace Research at the University of Hamburg, who introduced me to Klaus and instigated this event. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Klaus Gehrcke.
Thank you, Sonja, for the kind introduction. I'm happy to be here today, although I confess I'm still a little bit tired because of the time shift between Germany and the United States. But nonetheless, I'm happy to be here and give the presentation here on nuclear emergency response in Germany. The subtitle is A Long Way Towards Harmonization, and I hope it will get clear during my presentation what I mean with this. When I prepared for this presentation, I was thinking about what was actually the starting point of my professional career in radiation protection, and then I realized that it was the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979. I think there was one seminar about this only 2 weeks ago as well, last week. I was a student at the time, student of physics at the Humboldt University in Germany, and I didn't, sorry? I'll speak a little bit louder. I was a student at the time, a student of physics at the Humboldt University in Berlin at the time, and I don't remember if I took notice of the TMI accident at all. I don't think so. I think I didn't realize it. Nonetheless, it had implications on my later life, because when I, some years later, was looking for a job, there was a job opening in the former National Board for Nuclear Safety and Radiation Protection of Eastern Germany, the so-called German Democratic Republic, and I applied for it and I got the job. It was quite easy at the time to get a job in an authority or an industrial enterprise, because all these institutions, enterprises were constantly short of people. So I was applied in that National Board for Nuclear Safety and Radiation Protection, and the idea behind it was that I should be working on a concept on improving the education of operators of nuclear power plants, and this is where the TMI accident comes into play, because you know it much better than I do. This accident had large consequences for nuclear safety and radiation protection, not only in the US primarily, but also in other parts of the world. Among others, people learned that human factors are very important in such situations, and also in the GDR, in the Eastern Germany, they realized this, and that's why they wanted to work out a concept on how to build up an education and training for nuclear power plant operators. I soon realized that this was not my job, because I didn't have a specialized qualification in the field of nuclear technologies, etc., which would have been necessary. But I got a second chance when there was the possibility to change a little bit into the direction of radiation protection, and then after 2 or 3 years I found myself in the position of educating people in the fundamentals of radiation protection, the fundamental principles, the fundamental dose units, etc. And so that was the start of my professional career in radiation protection. When the Chernobyl accident occurred in April 1986, I had some years of experience in radiation protection. At the time of the accident, I was on holiday, so I didn't realize it until 2 days later, I think, when I heard the first radio news on Western media. When I came back to work on, I think it was the 3rd of May, they were desperately waiting for me, because I had also gathered some experience in gamma-ray spectroscopy at the time, and they were trying to cope with the tremendous requirements concerning measurement of environmental samples, etc. And because contamination in environmental samples in food, etc., was rather high, it wasn't necessary really to have low-level laboratories or so. And so I found myself in the midst of half a dozen of improvised measurement system where I measured contamination of iodine, cesium in milk and other samples for the next, say, 4 weeks or so. sometimes 16 hours a day. When the accident of Chernobyl occurred, there was a special situation in the Soviet Union. In 1985, the former Soviet leader, communist leader Mikhail Gorbachev, introduced the so-called perestroika and glasnost into his policy. I don't know if it is, these terms are known in America, but I think so. He tried to open the society, and he tried to introduce something like freedom of press, freedom of speech, etc. And that was in a situation when the Soviet Union was, the economy especially, was in really dire straits, and that was his way to try to open the society, to renew the society, in order to save the Soviet Union, which didn't work at the end, as we now know. But in East Germany, on the other side, there was a very restrictive information policy. From the government and from the authorities, people were informed only as far as necessary, and they were given only the necessary information, and it was hard to assess the situation for the people living there. They were the leaders, the communist leaders of former Eastern Germany, were very skeptical about the glasnost and perestroika developments in Russia, but nonetheless, it was still Russian cesium and Russian iodine that came to also Eastern Germany, and the judgment of the situation also depended on this special political situation. And then the Eastern Germany had embarked on widening of its nuclear power sector, because they were heavily dependent on lignite combustion, and nuclear power seemed to be the way out, because it was clear that the lignite deposits were to be exploited someday, and nuclear power was the way out. So they relied heavily on the expansion of that sector. And in such a situation, of course, the accident was not welcomed very much, because the radiological consequences were not as high, but the political consequences of that accident, which some say has finally led to the collapse of the whole Soviet system, were very high. So the policy was, I have brought with me some copies of former newspaper messages about the accident. The policy was to keep the people informed only as far as possible. In this first message on the 29th of April, there was a simple message, was accidental damage of a nuclear power plant in the Ukraine, and people affected will be helped, and that was it. It was a very small message on this newspaper. On the 3rd of April, they said that there was no reason to scrutiny. We have completely different reactors, which was true, because we had power water reactors of Russian type in the German Democratic Republic, and not the Chernobyl type of reactor, which was especially, let me say, simplified, dangerous. But nonetheless, the reactors in former Eastern Germany didn't, because they were of Russian type, they didn't comply with modern Western standards. For instance, they didn't have containments as they were built in Western nuclear power plants, because simply the technology wasn't available at the time. On the 3rd of May, the headline was stabilization of radioactivity values of a very low level. And as you can see, that's correct. The level was stabilizing at values that were rather low, but these figures were more or less meaningless to people who didn't have an idea what radiation protection was, how that the millibecquerels in the air were not decisive. Decisive was the dose to the people, and it's a long way to get to a dose from these millibecquerels. So it was a way to show we are open to give you the information you need, but it wasn't really open. It was not very helpful. Then another strategy appeared that was on the 5th of May. It became clear to the East German press that there was a libel campaign of Western mass media against the Soviet Union, and the Chernobyl accident was instrumentalized for that libel campaign. And then there was reported that there were thousands of nuclear accidents in the US just to distract from their own problems. In 1985, I don't know if any one of you knows that there were thousands of nuclear accidents in that year, but I doubt that. This is not to say that the East German government and the authorities were completely ignorant of radiation protection of the people in the country. As I already mentioned, thousands of measurements were made, and the authorities and also the government were well informed about the situation. 1 year later, you can here see the results or a map of former Eastern Germany with the results of iodine contamination of milk in May 1986. This is based on thousands of measurements, and the situation was known very well. On the right-hand side, you see the time dependency of iodine 131, cesium 137 at a measuring station near Berlin. So the situation was well known. The problem was there was no open communication to the public. And that's why people, like they did not also in this case, but also in other cases, tried to do was getting the missing information from Western media. They thought that the contamination level of Eastern and Western Germany couldn't be that different, and so the judgment of the situation, the evaluation of the situation in Western Germany would help to understand what their own situation was. As this map shows, it wasn't all that. It wasn't not really a mistake to think so, except the southern part of the former Western Germany, namely southern parts of Bavaria, which were rather high contaminated because of rain events and because of one of the clouds coming from the Chernobyl reactors coming from the south to Germany. That's why that region was contaminated relatively high, and it still is, because we have now until now we have cesium contaminations that are rather high, and which we can find in mushroom, for instance, and in wild boar, leading to an excession of limits to put these things on the market, and that's a problem for hunters, for instance. So what people found in Western media, this is a screenshot of the German news magazine Tagesschau of April the 29th, when they informed about that accident. What people found there was, unfortunately, a chaos of limits, a chaos of expert judgments of different experts, real experts who didn't really know what radiation protection was, but they tried to establish themselves as experts. They had different limit values in different parts of the country, and here you can see we had for limits for milk for iodine 131 in milk of 20 becquerel in Hessen, 50 becquerel in Schleswig-Holstein in the north of the country, and 500 becquerel in all other federal states. What did they learn from the accident in Western Germany? What was missing? First, measurement data and sufficient density. There were measurements made, but they weren't sufficient to evaluate the situation in a way that was really necessary. Then there were capabilities to missing capabilities to aggregate and disseminate measurement data. There were no plans for precautionary countermeasures. Harmonized limits for food, feeding staff, etc. were missing, and harmonized communication was missing. And consistency of countermeasures in neighboring countries was also one of the aspects that played a role. The political consequences in Western Germany of the accident were high. In June 1986, as a direct consequence of the Chernobyl accident, the Federal Ministry of the Environment was founded. Then, in December 1986, the so-called Radiation Protection Precautionary Act was set into force, regulating competences for measurements of environmental samples, food, etc., defining standardized measurement programs, defining limit values for food and feed, quality assurance measures, and catalogs of countermeasures were established on the basis of this act. And last but not least, the information system, the integrated information system, was created. Then eventually in 1989, the Federal Office for Radiation Protection of Germany was founded, also as one of the consequences of the Chernobyl accident. The Integrated Measurement and Information System, EMIS, essentially consists of 3 levels. The first level is the measurement level, where we have lots of laboratories in the federal states, which, according to a given program, take samples and measure radioactivity in these samples, and they provide these to a centralized database. Then we have monitoring networks of different institutions, and also these data are online delivered to the central database. Then we have a decision support system called RODOS, which is also part of the whole system, and that enables us to evaluate the situation, the radiological situation, and to make prognosis on the development of the situation. And then on top of it, level 1 is the Ministry of the Environment, which is responsible for the definition of countermeasures, for the levels which are defined for and limits for which are defined for contamination in food, etc. And they are also in charge of the international information exchange with on the European or international level, say with the International Atomic Energy Agency or with neighboring countries, etc. The ambient dose rate network, which is operated by the Federal Office for Radiation Protection, is one of the most dense networks in the world. We have about 2,000 stations spread over the whole country, according to with a grid width of about 15 up to 20 kilometers, and this is one of the, here you can see on this photograph, one of the probes which we use, and of these probes we have 2,000 spread over the whole country. On the right-hand side you can see ambient dose rate of one of the stations. Every 2 hours one of the measurement value will be submitted to the central database. In the middle you can see a little peak, but this is the result of a rain event, and when it rains, always natural radioactivity decay products of radon are washed out and deposited on the surface of the ground, and they give rise to variations of the natural dose rate in such situations. Well, then this system is complemented with so-called in situ gamma ray spectroscopy, where with mobile teams are complementing measurements of that dose rate probes with nuclide-specific information, which enables us to, have higher resolutions compared to that network, and to have nuclide-specific information, which is, of course, necessary to evaluate the situation from the radiological point of view. Today, what I didn't mention is that we also have helicopter-based systems, and the new development is unmanned vehicles are used also to improve our abilities to measure radioactivity in a very narrow grid. International conventions after the Chernobyl accident were the Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It became clear after the accident that, of course, information of the public was an issue, and the information from the Soviet Union came far too late. It took days before official statements were given, and these dates, this time, it could have been, or maybe it could have saved lives if other countries had been warned earlier, or at least there are situations thinkable where 2 days of delay may be really dangerous for some people who haven't been warned early enough. Then we have the Convention on Assistance in case of a nuclear accident or radiological emergency, also of the IAEA, and then on the European level we have community arrangements for the early information in the event of a radiological emergency. And on this basis, the so-called ACARI system was established, that is the European Community Urgent Radiological Information Exchange System, and part of that system is the European Community Radiological Data Exchange Platform, EURDEP, and the contributing countries provide their measurements for all the other participants, and so we have information online from all participating countries of the gamma dose rate measurements all the time. As you can see here, indeed, the German network seems to be one of the most dense networks, also in Europe. Then bilateral data information and exchange contracts were made with practically all the surrounding countries, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Switzerland, Austria, Czech Republic. And with all these countries, we are constantly in contact to make sure that in case of an emergency, there is a basis to exchange information very rapidly. Then in 2011, we all experienced the Fukushima shock. The German news magazine Spiegel thought that this was the end of the atomic age, which turned out to be true at least for Germany, but not for the whole world, as we know. And in Germany, the contamination that we experienced wasn't too high. There were only traces of iodine in the order of magnitude of some millibecquerel in the air that could be measured, and traces of iodine especially in rainwater, could be measured, but the situation was in no way of any radiological importance. Nonetheless, in Germany, we are facing a high public concern about ionizing radiation as a whole, and specifically ionizing radiation originating from nuclear power plants. In the BFS, we had about 2,000 inquiries about on the phone or via email within 1 month, and this is the same amount of inquiries which we normally receive in 1 year at the BFS. And the themes that were of interest were measurement techniques, limit values for food, protective measures, contamination of goods, ships, aircraft, business trips to Japan, of course, which is completely understandable. And even in exceptional cases, the question was, of pregnant women, shall I terminate my pregnancy, which is ridiculous when you see that it was hard to measure the radioactivity. And I don't know if anyone tried to assess the doses to the public from the Fukushima accident, because it was negligible. What have we learned from the chaos of limits in the Chernobyl during the Chernobyl accident? Since the Chernobyl accident, a special ordinance was in force, the so-called Chernobyl ordinance, which was meant to confine imports of food into the European Union. This was in place also at the time of the Fukushima accident, but on March the 25th, the EC set in force the so-called emergency limits ordinance, which brought some problems because the limits that were set in force then were partly higher than the aforementioned Chernobyl ordinance, and specifically the limits were higher than in Japan itself, which caused much protest among, for instance, consumer organizations, consumer protection organizations, and then after that the EC changed their minds, and they they set in force a new ordinance with lower levels, and they took all the lowest levels from the Chernobyl accident and the lowest level of the lowest Japanese levels for contamination of food. This way it became clear that it was not possible to export contaminated food from Japan on a legal basis to the European Union, because the limits were different. The Japanese limits were lower than in Germany or in the other countries of the European community. Then in April 2012, the revision, according to a new revision of that ordinance, was made, corresponding to lower limits for cesium-137 in Japan. And again, this creates the question whether this really creates trust. I doubt that. When a famous German orchestra, the Staatskapelle Berlin, planned to make a tour to Japan in 2016. The management of the orchestra asked me to tell them a little bit about the situation in Japan and what it all was about, and if they were safe when they were on trip in Japan. And it was really hard to tell them, yes, you can go there, it's no problem at all. I was facing problems like, will I be safe? Do I really trust? I was asked the question, do you really trust the values or the measurements of the Japanese authorities? And when I said yes, my credibility was questioned. So there was much distrust among the members of the orchestra. And one young woman asked me if she should postpone her desire to have children. So it was a very critical situation, and I tried to tell to them that the cosmic radiation exposure that they were going to experience during the flight to Japan and back was higher than what they were likely to experience during their whole stay in Japan. It is about some colleague of mine estimated 70 microsievert or so during the flight, and that is next to nothing. And the situation became a little bit better when I finally said I am a great lover of classic music, and you don't need a radiation protection expert, but if you can afford to pay me, I would really like to join you on the tour. I don't know if that was really convincing or the decisive factor, but this shows that it is really difficult to regain trust once it is lost. And that was, eventually it was a very successful tour, and everyone was happy, and I was invited to come to one of the concerts when they were back, and it was a great event, a great evening which I had there. And I think they were, in the end, they were pleased with the information I gave them. And but this just illustrates how much people fear radioactivity and how much distrust is there in the official measurements and official announcements about the situation. Sorry, I'm speaking much too long, I think. Well, the most important consequences in Germany were, despite high safety requirements and the low calculated probability, nuclear accidents, including severe ones, up to the IMIS level 7, can happen, even in modern Western-type reactors. And this led to the federal government's decision on an accelerated nuclear phase out of nuclear energy in Germany, and 8 reactors were shut down immediately after the accident, and the others will be finally shut down by the end of 2022. And then it was decided that a critical review of the existing emergency preparedness and response system in Germany was necessary, also triggered, of course, by new ICRP recommendations of 2007 and the new EURDEP directive. This is the new EURDEP directive is, so to say, the European basic safety standards in radiation protection. I don't know if you are familiar with these terms. The German Radiation Protection Commission issued 67 recommendations as a result of the Fukushima accidents concerning the further development of emergency preparedness and response in Germany. First of all, they required or they recommended more detailed planning of nuclear accidents and other scenarios, the definition of reference scenarios and source terms, the establishment of different emergency plans at different levels. Then they proposed the harmonization of precautionary radiation protection and nuclear disaster measurements, which were separated, more or less separated in Germany at the time. Because the disaster management is in Germany the responsibility of the federal states and the counties where the nuclear power plants are situated, while the precautionary radiation protection is the responsibility of the the federation, so to say. These things had developed more or less independently from each other. And one of the consequences and the recommendations of the Commission was, let us bring things together so as to have a unique base to decide on countermeasures, to assess the situation and decide on countermeasures, etc. And well, this is work in progress. We are just now about to establish such a system with a common radiological situation assessment center as one of the central points of the new system. The Commission also recommended harmonization of communication strategies, and we all know that this is of really great importance. And one of the legal bases for the new system of radiation protection in emergency situations is also the already mentioned directive, European Basic Safety Standards. And what we did is, according to the recommendations in the emergency planning to develop the emergency planning in Germany, was defining scenarios. It's a set of 10 scenarios, starting with accidents in nuclear power plants, accidents in near-border power plants, accidents in Europe, other installation, terroristic attacks, transport accidents, etc. And with these scenarios, we are defining possible source terms, radiological consequences, and emergency plans at the moment. Also, we tried to analyze what the radiological impacts of an accident of the Fukushima type in one of the existing nuclear power plants in Germany, what the radiological consequences of such an accident would be in the country. That is, the German Commission on Radiological Protection, they recommended that the nuclear emergency preparedness in Germany be based on the severity of the consequences of large accidents rather than the probability of their occurrence. That meant that higher source terms were used as the basis of the definition of the planning zones for emergency preparedness. And these planning zones were widened from in the central zone for the countermeasure evacuation within 6 hours from 2 kilometers to 5 kilometers. In the middle zone, evacuation within 24 hours from the old radius of 10 kilometers to 20 kilometers. The outer zone of 20 kilometers up to 100 kilometers for iodine blocking and sheltering. And all the remaining national territory was set to be the planning zone for iodine blocking for children and pregnant women. Well, phase out of nuclear energy, problem solved? No, not at all. We have in the vicinity of Germany, we have lots of nuclear power plants in Switzerland, in France. Partly they are very close to the German border, less than 5 kilometers. Leibstadt in Switzerland and Fessenheim in France, less than 20 kilometers. Bersenau in Switzerland and Cattenom in France. So, of course, we cannot get rid of the problem by just shutting down the German nuclear power plants. Well, coming back to the harmonization aspects, an analysis was made what the difference in the different systems in emergency preparedness in Europe were. And there's a bright a range of differences, starting with the types of protection actions, criteria for intervention levels, operational intervention levels, methods for assessing source terms, methods for radiological impact assessment and dispersion modeling, definitions of emergency planning zones, etc., etc. And then a working group was established by the so-called Gehrcke. Gehrcke is the heads of European radiation protection competent authorities, and VENRA is Western Europe's Nuclear Regulators Association, and they analyzed this situation. They came to the conclusion that it was a good idea to enhance the mutual understanding before a nuclear accident and in case of an accident. An early case of an accident, that means the first hours, when the country which is affected by an accident in a neighboring country doesn't have the necessary information to deal the situation with their own, based on their own information. They just do the same what the country where the accident occurred does. And in the midterm, after the first hours, it is planned to develop a common situation report. One specific problem that I took as an example is the iodine thyroid blocking in Europe. This picture shows you that we have very different levels of dose to the thyroid, where iodine tablets are planned to be given to people. For example, in Denmark, it is 10 millisievert to the thyroid for children and pregnant women, and 50 millisievert for adults younger than 40 years. In Germany, we have 50 millisievert for children and pregnant women, and 250 millisievert for adults younger than 55 years. And we have different values and different criteria in other countries, and that is a very large problem at the moment, which we hopefully will solve one day. There's much discussion about that at the moment, but this can be convincing, and it can be trustworthy in case of an emergency. If, as I already mentioned, there are power plants that are almost situated at the border between France and Germany, for instance, and it would become very difficult to communicate that on the left-hand side of the border other measures were taken then on the right-hand side of the border. So harmonization, is that an everlasting story? The answer is, I think so. This picture shows the result of a new development of BFS that is meant to reconstruct doses that occurred as a result of a nuclear accident to individuals based on information that can be gathered on a smartphone, based on information of the GPS systems and networks, dose rates that are constructed based on our dose rate network that I already mentioned. And this is of importance to have the individual doses firstly because it is necessary to know what help do these people need, and then we have to stick to the new standards. The reference values which we now use to assess the situation are based on residual dose, and this includes the dose that people already have experienced before the countermeasures are taken, which includes it is necessary to know what the doses what doses they already received. This wouldn't have been possible at the time of Chernobyl because we had no smartphones, because GPS wasn't available, etc. So this is a new development, and if I remember the first days of when I started my career in radiation protection, we were just trying to establish effective dose as an integrating risk-based measure of potential health effects, cancer especially among people. In 1986, the radiation protection system wasn't considering emergency situations, at least not in Europe. The situation was all situations that we considered were plant exposure situations, and we had limits for workers and limits for the public that were applied to the emergency situation, or at least it was tried to apply them to emergency situations, as the Chernobyl accident, which didn't work, at least not in the vicinity of the nuclear power plant. So the concept of intervention was invented by international organizations, and now we have the concept of plant exposures on the one hand side, not interventions anymore, but emergency situations and existing exposure situations. So I can't see any reason why the system of radiation protection is going to be ready one day. We will have new knowledge, and we will have new social phenomena, and it will constantly be developing. And as one of the examples, let me just mention the Safecast project as a citizen science project which developed in Japan shortly after the accident as a reaction of people who thought they couldn't trust the official measurements and did their measurements on their own and created that network. And meanwhile, I think that was by the end of 2016, there were 50 million measurements in the database that were created. And this is not only a technical development, it is also a social development in society. So that makes me convinced that we will be facing new developments, not only in technology, but also in society, in our biological knowledge of the effects of ionizing radiation, etc. So emergency response and emergency preparedness will be a constant issue also in the future. And last, to the harmonization issue, just tomorrow a colleague of mine will be here in Washington and take part in a meeting of the International Civil Aviation Organization, and they are caring about radiation exposures of crews and of passengers and aircrafts, and trying to harmonize approaches to make prognosis about clouds of radioactivity, which of course should be avoided by aircrafts, etc. So this also shows that emergency preparedness is constantly developing. It will not be ready one day. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Klaus. So we'll open it up for questions and comments now. For those of you watching us online, again, the email to send questions and comments to is SIREN, SIREN, @vt.edu.
Yes. Hi, I'm Mel Ulau. This is turned on. Okay. And I have a question regarding whether Germany receives electrical power via a grid that crosses national boundaries, specifically whether Germany receives electrical power from nuclear plants outside of Germany.
Well, that's a question that's hard to answer. I cannot exclude it. I think there is over the whole of Europe, the electrical power is put on the market, on the European market, and I think so, yes, that there will also be electrical power, if you can differentiate it at all, on the market in Germany, stemming from countries outside of Germany. But I don't know exactly what the amount is, if it is possible to make such a calculation. But I cannot exclude it.
The reason I asked that particular question is in context of the phase out of the intent behind the phase out of fission nuclear plants in Germany, and if electrical power is actually provided through a broader European grid, that seems to defeat the intent within the boundaries of Germany. Just a comment. I'm not looking for.
Yes, of course. With the phase out of nuclear energy in Germany, you of course you are not able to shut down the nuclear power plants in the surrounding countries. Of course. Nonetheless, I wouldn't say that it is a contradiction, because I think the development. My personal view is. That the development in Germany as a whole is a good development, because it is a development in the direction of using what we sometimes say alternative energy sources, wind energy, solar energy, etc. And I think this makes us independent of nuclear power, of uranium delivery, etc. So I think as a whole it is a good development, but of course Germany is not an independent country, considering the supply of electrical power, of course.
Has there been any? Oh, what? Can you introduce? Sure. Yes, my name is Afroz Mohammed, and I'm a researcher and work on partnerships at Virginia Tech. Has there been any effort for a German, on the part of German anti-nuclear advocates, to sort of, connect with their colleagues in neighboring countries? Because it would seem like there might be more concern and attention to the nuclear plants that might have an impact on Germany, if anything should happen.
It was a bit difficult to understand, but as far as I got it, you mean if we are in contact in Germany with colleagues from other European countries?
Anti-nuclear activists.
Yeah. I mean, if there was sort of any effort, to on the part of the anti-nuclear activists in Germany to try to almost, influence colleagues in adjacent countries.
Sorry, but I can't answer that question. I simply don't know.
All right, I had Gil first, I think. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Gilbert Brown. I'm a emeritus nuclear engineering professor, and thank you for the talk. It was very clear and very interesting. And I find it kind of interesting that the first question had to do with energy utilization in Germany, because, I mean, that's a whole nother topic of trying to stop the ice caps from melting by giving up on clearly the biggest source of clean energy other than wind and solar and hydro. And in your country in particular, you use a lot of coal, but that's not your expertise and not your point.
No,
so my questions have to do with, And on your very last slide, I thought it would have been very interesting if the airplane people would talk about radiation not flying through some event, but just in general, as you alluded to when you told us the story about the Japanese, about your symphony going to Japan, and that they'd get more radiation just routinely flying. It's my understanding that the airline people do not badge themselves as a radiation worker would, yet they're working in a radiation environment that's much bigger than what we get every day here on the ground. That's a comment. You can comment on that if you don't mind. I would also, as a question, ask you what you believe my understanding is that the basis for these precautionary reactions to releases of radiation or exposures to radiation, let's say in general, going to the dentist even, are based on LNT. I know you know what LNT is, linear
yes,
non-threshold. So can you comment on the efficacy of LNT? It's my understanding that some folks think that we are over-precautious at the low levels that we're regulating to.
I don't know if the first remark also included a question concerning the cosmic radiation. Of course, I don't know what the situation in the US is, but at least in Europe, the aircraft crews are supervised. Of course, they don't have any badges or so, but they are supervised by just computer codes that are fed with the cosmic radiation, knowledge of the cosmic radiation in different flight routes, and so it is just calculated based on the knowledge of the cosmic radiation over the globe. And the mean values are, according to my knowledge, about 2 or 3 millisievert a year for. It is the largest group of professionally exposed people in Germany, but the doses are, well, 2 or 3 millisievert in the mean, according to the flight plans, which are sometimes adapted to the requirements of radiation protection. What LNT, I didn't know. Of course, I know what LNT is, but I'm not sure if I got the question. Sorry.
Are we over-regulating radiation protection at the lower levels?
I think there are some. It's difficult to say. I think there are. Radiation protection is a very wide field. There are sometimes doses that are regulated in the order of magnitude of, say, 10 microsieverts, for instance, as a requirement for final repositories for radioactive waste, for instance. Then we have 100 microsievert per year as a value that is that is used to evaluate drinking water, for instance. Then we have the general value of 1 millisievert per year that is used as a limit for the population. And then we have 20 millisievert, as you know, as the limit for workers, etc., etc. So it is rather unhomogeneous, the whole system. And of course, one can come to the conclusion that we are overdoing in a little bit in one way or the other, of course. Yeah, I think sometimes I also believe that it's a bit too much what we do in some areas, whereas in other areas, such as we discussed it before, radon protection against natural radiation sources, including radon in homes, where exposures that result in doses as high as maybe 10, 20 millisievert a year are accepted without any problem or so. So the whole system is not consistent when you consider the basis, the dose as the metric.
Okay, hi, it's Jeff Glick here. I'm an adjunct professor here at Virginia Tech and work at Department of Homeland Security. Question, going back to the slide you showed on dosage rates, the different ones for the different countries in the European Union, for children, for adults, and they're widely varied. And going back to your harmonization theme, do you think science would there should be some sort of scientific basis that all these countries could adopt the same ones? Why are they so different? And is there any sort of way out of that difference that would develop a harmonized, sort of uniform way of looking at this type of exposure issue? Thank you.
Well, I think unfortunately it's not just a scientific problem, but it is, of course, science does play a role, but to a certain extent it is just conventions that are made in the different countries. For instance, that iodine thyroid blocking theme is discussed at the moment in Germany. We are discussing it with France, etc. We are talking about whether it makes sense to confine the iodine thyroid blocking to people not older than 45 years or so. It is scientific, from a scientific point of view. Of course, one could say people elder than 40, 45 years or so are not have no benefit from iodine blocking, because the probability of developing thyroid cancer is so low that it simply doesn't make sense. On the other hand, I fear that harmonization with neighboring countries, having equal criteria for people living on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side of the Rhine River is also a great value, because this creates trust. And so it is always a question of balancing between scientific evidence, scientific aspects on the one hand side, and on the other hand side it is just a convention. So this is what makes harmonization so difficult, I feel, because there are historic regions, historic developments in the certain countries, and there are economic reasons, etc. So I think it's going to be a hard job to have final harmonization, even for that on that grounds, because it is, to a certain extent, it's not just science. It is also a matter of conventions in society. So when there wasn't time enough to explain the methodology to define the new planning zones in Germany for measures just like sheltering, evacuation, thyroid blocking, etc. I didn't go to in that detail, but there is a scientific basis for that, based on a specific source term, that is assumptions on the amount of radioactivity that is released into the atmosphere, and then based on a lot of calculations on how the radioactivity spreads over the country, etc. And then there comes some statistics under which weather conditions, if you take 365 days of a year or so and the weather conditions, then you get a statistic how far away the dose reaches to the thyroid, for instance. And then you have a distribution of values. And then there is a point where it becomes a little bit arbitrary. If you think it is the 80th percentile which you use for the definition of you of your planning zones, the result will be different from the situation when you took this, maybe the 50th percentile or the 19th percentile or so. And this is convention. It is not science. It is convention. It's a degree of safety that science that people want to have, etc. So, and I think this is characterizes the situation in the whole system. That's why I'm not too optimistic that we will ever reach total harmonization.
Any other questions, comments?
Yes, Dan Miller from Virginia Tech. I'm a PhD candidate here. Excellent presentation, very, very useful information. And you mentioned that the German public is very concerned about radiation, kind of almost no matter what it is, except for maybe a radon in their basements. But so concerning the 1,800 probes, the radiation probes that are distributed throughout the country, how does the public react with the information, from that, showing the ambient dosage? Is that a concern for them if they have that information?
They have that information. We have it on the net. Everyone can, at any time, look into the system, have a look into the system and see what the dose rate is at the nearest probe to the place where he or she lives. So we have an open strategy to provide these data to the public, and there's no problem about it. It is natural radioactivity, and it is accepted, I think. We don't have any problems with that. One problem that we might have is, in case of a nuclear emergency, these values are also available. And what I'm a little bit fear is that it is so easy to calculate wrong things based on these values. So if you have a gamma dose rate of I don't know, an enhanced gamma dose rate as a result of a contamination from a nuclear accident, say 1,000 nanosievert, 1 microsievert per hour or so. It is this is just a value of a gamma dose external dose rate. It is difficult to say what it means for exposure of people. And we know how to calculate the doses based on these measurement results, but interpretation of these results, it's so easy to say it is one microsievert per hour. If I have a reference value for, say, sheltering of 10 millisieverts per hour, so it's simple arithmetic to it seems to be simple arithmetic, just to come to the conclusion I am in a region where I'd better stay in my house or so. So it is, of course, we follow in a strategy to make ourselves open and to publish the data, and they are even available on smartphones meanwhile. But there's also a certain danger of misunderstanding, I'm not going to say misuse, but at least misunderstanding. And this is, again, a matter of how to communicate these results and being faster in an emergency situation and more consistent than maybe others who also try to interpret the results. This is a challenge, a huge challenge, of course, to the authorities.
Klaus, could you go back in your slides to the one with the measuring stations across Europe, please? Mm-hmm. I have two questions about this map. One is, why is there such a dense concentration of measuring stations in the Baltics? And then the second question, Britain also seems to have a fair amount of measuring stations. And I wonder if you could say something about potential consequences of Brexit on these Euratom treaties, and how you will be able to access the data that the British produce, or vice versa?
Well, to be honest, to the last question, I didn't realize so far that the Brexit could create a problem. I think that it will be possible to have conventions with Great Britain also to exchange these data. We also have countries involved in the system that are not members of the European Union, just like Turkey, as you can see. So this is not going to be a problem, I think. And concerning the density of the probes, to be honest, I don't know. It is historically grown. The whole system was not invented after the Chernobyl accident, actually, but it is based on a network that was created after the Second World War, when, as a result or as a response to during the Cold War, during the phase when atomic weapons were tested in the atmosphere, etc. And then there was a specific need to have as much information as possible among the authorities, governments, and the population in Germany and in other parts like Belgium or so. But I'm not sure if there is really a scientific ground to have such a dense network of gamma dose rate probes.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Mel Ulau from Virginia Tech again. And you had mentioned in towards the end of your presentation, SafeCast. In context of trust, does the German government actually help? Does a citizen-based collection of data, as far as radiation is concerned, help elevate trust, and does the German government make some use of these citizen-based groups for that particular purpose?
No, according to my knowledge, we haven't such a system at the moment in Germany, because it was developed, as you know, in Japan. And I think it would be a little bit contradictory if we, with governmental authorities, try to establish such a system. The idea is, of course, being independent of governmental authority measurements. But I think we should be open in case of an emergency that is of any radiological importance in Germany. We should be open to be in contact with such groups that might be developing in such situations. But at the moment, I'm not aware that there are such groups existing in Germany as well.
I have a question about the measurements from this network that you show. This is this the civilian measurements, or this is the government? These measurements, all those dots, those are done by the government or by people?
No, this is run by the government, run by BFS to be precise.
All right, I mean, but the question is, at least in the States, in the United States, there are different backgrounds. You alluded to it with radon, but if you integrate the dose, say in Denver, it could be twice what it is where we are here. And if you live near granite, you get more background than if you live in a field, more in farm country, I suppose. I'm not a radiation health physicist. But do you know what the variation is in this background that would create some sort of, even when you're taking an experiment in the same place, it could vary, plus and minus. Do you know? Is it a factor of 2? Is it a factor of... And the reason I'm asking is that difference is often what we're regulating to, even less than that difference, or even less than the absolute value, never mind the difference. So it's important because numeracy is not something we're born with. Understanding what the numbers mean and what kind of action you might take based on what the reading is. I mean, we say TMI to a young person and they don't say 3 Mile Island, they say too much information. And I think we may be going in this direction. So the question is, what's the variation?
The variation of gamma dose rate that you see with these this system is designed to measure artificial radioactivity, of course. But of course, we measure normally we measure the natural measure gamma radiation coming from the ground, of course, and cosmic radiation. But the variation is between, I think, some maybe 50 nanosievert per hour or so at some places in the north of the country, up to maybe 200, 300 nanosievert per hour in the mountainous regions of the mountains or on the Alps or so, with higher values. This may be something like the 19th percentile of the distribution or something. There are also higher values in some regions. Creating I think the mean exposure to the public of about 2 millisievert per year, but this is dominated by radon exposure, of course. And the probes are at specific locations. They are specifically the locations where the probes are specifically chosen so to have correct measuring conditions. So we have a flat area, so we have no disturbance of any buildings that are maybe closer than, I don't know what the exact criterion is, etc. And then the natural background radiation is measured, and then the level at which an alarm is given is set, taking into account the natural background level at this station.
Any other questions, comments for our speaker?
Dan Miller again from Virginia Tech, and maybe a follow-up on my previous question. You mentioned right after Fukushima, you had in the first month, 2,000 inquiries in, and which equaled your annual number of questions. Now, prior to, I assume they're asking about, obviously they were asking about Fukushima. So prior to that, what was the typical questions that people would ask, prior to Fukushima, for radiation? What were they concerned about?
Typical questions not related to Fukushima.
Yes.
Depends. At the moment, we have lots of questions concerning natural radiation, especially radon in Germany, because since May last year, we have a new atomic law in place in Germany, and according to the first in history, based on the European Basic Safety Standards, we have a reference level of radon. It is set to 300 becquerels per cubic meter in homes and at workplaces. And we have many inquiries about what is of the type, what is can I expect in my home? What radon exposure can I expect in my home? Which is, of course, difficult to answer, but we have published a map of radon concentrations in soil, for instance, which serves as a basis to prioritize measures to protect people from enhanced levels of radon exposure. And this is very often the basis. People find that on the net, and then they are when they see, oh, I live in the region where higher radon concentrations in the ground have been measured. So am I exposed in my house to these to higher radon concentrations? This is a typical question which typically can't be answered because it depends not only on the radon concentration on the ground, but also on what house is it, what is the habits of the inhabitants, etc. So normally what we recommend is just make measurements. Well, this is one of the typical questions.
Okay. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but if you have any further questions, Klaus will be around for about half an hour, so you're welcome to approach him after we wrap up here. There's also some food left. Please join us and join me in thanking our speaker for a fascinating talk and a great discussion. Thank you.